Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we discuss the proposed land bank to help implement the Places for People plan. I'm Scott Wadle, the director of the Wichita-Sedgwick County Metropolitan Area Planning Department. And joining me tonight are some wonderful guests. We have Mary Hunt, we have Angeline Johnson, and Jeff Van Zandt. And we're all here to help provide information about the land bank and to answer questions. And tonight is hoped to be an interactive session. So Mary, why don't you help share how folks can participate and get involved in the discussion?
All right. If you have a question or a comment during this session here tonight, you can leave them in the comments section of your Facebook page, and we'll review them later and try to answer them as best we can. If you want to learn more about Places for People plan, you can visit wichita.gov /Places for People. There you will find information about the plan, the upcoming dates for future town hall events, and you can also submit your email address if you'd like to receive updates periodically. And there's also a button on that page that allows you to make comments at any time.
Wonderful, thank you. And with that, we'll go ahead and go to the PowerPoint. We'll go through that, and then there'll be an opportunity for comments and questions. All right, well, very good. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Tonight, we're talking about the land bank proposal. This is the first of a series of different events and opportunities for public comment. Another one happens on February 23rd. Please make sure to note that on your calendars. We'll be talking about zoning. So throughout the process, there'll be lots of opportunities for public comments. So we look forward to hearing your questions and seeing if we can provide additional information. So comments and questions, as Mary indicated, can be provided in a variety of different ways. You can do that on the website. You can email us. You can use the phone. You can also even drop off a letter if you like to send to the planning department. And as always, you can also contact us through social media and submit questions that way. So again, we'll have a process that's got a lot of different opportunities for comments. Those will go all the way through this spring, so we look forward to hearing from folks. Tonight, we'll be talking specifically about the land bank. This is an opportunity for us to share information about the proposal and about the process, but also an opportunity to answer any questions and receive feedback or input about it. So tonight, we'll go over a background about why a land bank is being proposed in the first place, and then the second part will be really what is in the land bank proposal, what exactly is being proposed. In terms of background, you'll see how it's related to the implementation of the Community Investments Plan, and then which went into the Places for People plan, and then the three initiatives. Again, tonight we'll be talking about land bank, but there are two additional ones, zoning and then incentives and nodes. We'll be talking about those at a future date. So the Community Investments Plan, this was adopted by both the city and the county. It's the comprehensive plan. It was adopted back in 2016, and there was an infrastructure focus, really focused on things like transportation, water, financing of those infrastructure improvements. Included within the plan was a recommendation for an urban infill strategy, and also the concept of an established central area, which I'll describe in just a moment. The process to develop the Community Investments Plan lasted over 4 years, involved more than 4,000 responses on surveys, and went over more than 50 meetings and events for folks to gather information and provide input. During the plan, we looked at community trends, and there were a number of them that were identified. Here are some of the more prominent ones. So the plan forecasted an era of fiscal constraint, that there wasn't going to be any dramatic changes in revenue over the course of the plan. And so it was fiscally constrained. In addition, it identified a trend of smaller household sizes, something that's happening in many different communities across the country. Also more diverse population and an older population. It also forecasted a preference for more transportation options, something that we're seeing from surveys from young professionals and others, indicating a desire for not only being able to get around in a motor vehicle, but also to be able to walk, to be able to bike, to take a scooter, to take transit to get to their destinations. And then the last one here on the slide is we also forecasted a trend of increasing national and international competition for talent. And I think that these are things that are also showing up in other communities, but as well as other research and reports that are taking place in our own community. In terms of the urban infill strategy, it really called for a reverse on patterns of abandonment and decline. So reinvestment in existing neighborhoods for a variety of different reasons. But also it made highlights that using and growing existing areas helps us take advantage of our existing infrastructure and services that are already in place and can help improve the quality of life in areas that in some cases are experiencing abandonment or a loss of investment. As I mentioned earlier, there's a map in the Community Investments Plan that identifies the established central area. This is essentially the areas in Wichita and surrounding that were developed around the 1960s or before. So you can see that it extends from Ridge Road on the west to Rock Road on the east, 29th to the north, and 31st Street on the south. So that was the Community Investments Plan. Now, within the Community Investments Plan, it called for development of an urban infill strategy, and that is known today as the Places for People Plan. The Places for People Plan was adopted in 2019. It's a fairly recent document. It includes a vision for strong neighborhoods, vibrant centers, a strong economy. But the way to achieve that, the way that's recommended in the Places for People Plan is through infill reinvestment, so reinvestment in existing areas, emphasis on walkable design, so making places that are walkable even more vibrant, and helping to introduce environments that are more walkable for places that perhaps aren't. Multimodal transportation, so a variety of different ways for folks to get around, and a variety of housing options. The Places for People Plan also identified different nodes or areas where there's an importance in terms of clustering or crossroads, as well as areas of stability, so areas where where the residents indicated a desire to keep things fairly similar, and also areas of opportunity where there were areas for opportunities for change in the future. The Places for People Plan received a lot of feedback. Part of that was through an advisory committee, and you can see the different ones that were there, as well as more than 55 public meetings and hundreds of survey responses. Within the Places for People Plan, as we talked about, there were a number of different implementation strategies, 3 of them that are very important for the work that's going on today. One was the land bank recommendation, another one was a zoning updates recommendation, and the third one was looking at strategic investments. So how can we look to areas where the markets and investments are not happening and look at strategies or actions that we can take to improve those, to change that to where they are. So tonight, of course, we're going to cover the land bank, and I'm very excited that we have an opportunity to talk about that. So the first question that often comes up about a land bank is, well, what is a land bank? And in this case, a land bank is a government entity, so it's part of the government, and it's focused on conversion of land that's maybe not the most productive, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's land that can be vacant, can be abandoned, perhaps is even tax delinquent. So land that's maybe not being fully utilized, and it makes it into productive use. So here's an example of what we're talking about, and these are photos from Habitat for Humanity. On the left, you'll see a before picture of a lot that it's been vacant, it's been for quite some time perhaps abandoned. It's got overgrowth on it. Perhaps there are circumstances with, maybe there are issues with the title. Maybe there are other issues around the property that for whatever reason it's not been sold, it's not being utilized. And then here you can see a development that they've recently done nearby and on the same property. So in essence, a land bank gets land property back to productive use. So the land banks exist in a variety of different cities, states, et cetera, organizations. So one thing that we did is we did a survey of land banks in and around Wichita and the country. We looked at 9 different communities. And the thing to keep in mind when you're looking at places that are outside of Kansas is that land banks are authorized, the formation of them is authorized by state legislation. So from different states, from state to state, they can look different. So that's an important note. But in general, we were looking at them to say, well, how are they organized and how do they operate? And what we found is that there's general alignment in terms of board memberships. Most boards of land banks are appointed by elected officials. Likewise, we also found alignment in that land banks generally either do in-house rehab or they partner with partnering organizations to see the rehab of existing housing. In addition, there tends to be a focus on revitalization, affordable housing, and home ownership by land banks. And this is important because you'll see it reflected in the recommendations for the proposal for here in Wichita. In addition, land banks, we found that many of them, most of them, I think if not all of them, require a subsidy for operations. And the staffing really varied. The staffing really varied depending on the size of the organization, of course, how many properties they had, how they were formed, what their missions were. So there was a lot of variety in those. So that perhaps raises the question, well, that's great, Scott. You've told us about a survey of land banks across the country, but what does that mean here in Wichita? And why is a land bank important to Wichita? Well, a land bank can do many of the things that local governments currently can do many of the things that a land bank can do. But a land bank specifically has an advantage in that it is an organization that's focused on bringing properties into productive use, focused on revitalization. A land bank in the state of Kansas has the ability to abate special assessments and back taxes, to manage and maintain properties to make sure that they're not weedy or overgrown, and to sort through ownership and title issues, which from our discussions we've learned can be quite extensive and can take quite a bit of time to sort out. So the documents that have been prepared so far for the proposed land bank here in Wichita include a draft mission statement, a draft ordinance, draft bylaws, draft policies, and frequently asked questions. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these documents. But before we do, I want to turn to Mary and ask, now Mary, these documents are available on the website, correct?
Yeah, they're available right now, all of them.
Wonderful. So folks, as you're watching this, you can click on over there and check them out. So the mission statement, as you might expect, reflects a lot of the material that we've covered so far, that the land bank will promote the revitalization of neighborhoods, consistent with the Wichita Places for People plan through the management and transfer of properties that are deemed underutilized. So hopefully you'll see hopefully you'll recognize a lot of those from the terms and the language that we used earlier. Now, how the land bank is formed. In the city of Wichita, a land bank would be formed through an ordinance passed by the city council. And the draft language for that ordinance, again, is posted on the website. And it would establish a land bank with a board of trustees of 7 members. And it would allow ad hoc advisory committees to be formed. So if there's a particular neighborhood or a particular issue that the land bank is focused on, they can have an advisory committee formed to help advise them on that. Now, the focus area of the land bank would be the established central area, again, that map that we showed, ridge to rock, and so forth, and that it would focus not only there, that would be the focus, but it would also have the ability to work on underutilized or distressed properties that are perhaps outside of the ECA. So the focus would be the ECA, but it would also have the ability to work with and on properties that are outside of that area. The ordinance also specifies that any purchase, sale, or transfer of the property must be approved by the city council. So this is not an organization that's operating on its own. All transfers, sales, or purchases of properties would have to be presented to the city council for city council approval and provide a justification and background on that. The land bank board would be advisory to the city council. So again, it would be not a separate organization, but would be a subsidiary of the city. Now note, an important note here is that state law does not provide for the use of eminent domain by a land bank. So this is a very important distinction from an urban renewal authority, which people may be familiar with from the 70s, per se. Land banks cannot take property away from someone who does not want to sell it. It's got to be a voluntary donation, sale, transfer. And again, it's only under the authority of the city council that the city council needs to approve. So if an applicant, for instance, wished to purchase a piece of property from the land bank, they would go first submit a proposal to the land bank. And that proposal would be evaluated and a recommendation submitted to the Wichita City Council for the City Council to authorize. Jeff, I'm going to pause here and I'm just going to say, are there any other points that I'm missing? I'm kind of touching on it at a high level.
Yeah. No, you covered it very well. Again, going back to eminent domain, the state law prohibits the use of eminent domain for other than a public purpose, except for some very minor exceptions. The land bank's design is to acquire property through one of the means and then immediately, or as soon as possible, convey it for a private purpose to an individual or so. And eminent domain is a very costly and inefficient way to act, even if it had the authority to engage in eminent domain.
Thank you. Thanks you. I think it's good for folks to understand that it's not allowed by the land bank. So just emphasizing that point. But you also brought up another good point, which is about speed and timing. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. In terms of policies and procedures, we're currently working on a draft of this document. I don't believe that that's finalized. And in fact, the procedures will not be finalized until there's a full board that's been appointed. But we are working on the policies. But you should know that currently, as a working product, that the focus is on the established central area, and that the priorities are affordable housing and neighborhood revitalization, which could take the form of housing, retail, and open space. Because we've heard from a number of different meetings, talking to stakeholders involved in revitalization of areas, that these are housing, retail, and especially open space are very important to neighborhoods and revitalization and reinvestment in them. In addition, as Jeff has indicated, we really see that the land bank, the current draft, would promote quick property transition. So this would not be a land bank that would hold on to properties for a long period of time and maintain those properties for many, many years. This would be a nimble organization that would take on properties only so much as its capacity is and work to quickly transition those properties into more productive use. So getting them into a use that's benefiting the community or owners. So the targeted strategic acquisitions, not acquiring everything that doesn't sell at the tax sale, for instance. That there would be an application process for a property sale or transfer. So this would be that someone who wished to purchase a property would typically submit an application and explain why they are seeking to purchase one, what their offer is, etc., other details of it, and really make the case for how they can put it back into productive use. And again, to emphasize that any purchase, sale, transfer of the property must be approved by the City Council. Now, we also have an FAQ, which is available on the website, that includes a number of different topics. You see them listed here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just know that if you do have a question, you may be able to find it on the FAQ, and if you can't, we're going to go ahead and continue to update that document based on the questions that we receive. So next steps. So the next step is, if you've got comments, please do take the time, send us a note. We'd love to hear from you. We also have a number of different public engagement opportunities coming up for public comments. And I want to encourage you to participate with the zoning Facebook town hall that's coming up on February 23rd. But you can see district advisory boards, planning commission. There'll be great opportunities to learn more about it and provide comments. In addition, we're also going to reach out and talk to stakeholders about both the proposed land bank and the proposed changes for zoning. So here are a number of different stakeholders that we've identified, and we'll continue to do outreach to folks. If you, after this event, if you have questions, you have comments, you can always reach out to Mary Hunt. You can see her phone number is listed here, and then we also, our offices over at the Reagan Building, so feel free to drop us a letter, drop us a note. We'd love to hear from you. And that concludes the presentation for tonight. So now comes the most exciting part, which is hearing from you, learning what people think and what their questions are. Before we turn to that, though, I just want to turn over to Angeline and see, is there anything, Angeline, that you think we missed or that we should talk about or emphasize before we go to questions?
No, I think we really covered it, and this is the exciting part, hearing from the public and getting their thoughts.
Awesome. All right, well, let's see what we've got.
All right, well, we do have several questions that have come in through Facebook and email, so we'll try to get to all of them. So thanks everyone who has weighed in so far. You can continue to ask questions. To kick it off, we have a couple questions that have come through. The first one is, how is a land bank formed?
How is a land bank formed? Well, for that one, I'm going to defer that one to Jeff.
Land banks are a creature of Kansas statute, and they are formed by the city council adopting an ordinance establishing the land bank.
All right, thank you. And a question along those lines, when is the anticipated launch date for the land bank to allow acquisition of these properties?
Oh, that's a good question, but it depends on a number of different factors. Of course, the first one being passing of an ordinance to create a land bank. Second one being the appointments of a board. A third really being getting the policies and procedures into place. So there's a number of different steps that have to take place before the land bank would be in a position to recommend acquisition of properties to the city council. So I don't know that I would venture a timing quite yet, but rather just indicate the different steps that are necessary. And of course, we'll keep people posted on the website in terms of implementation.
Wonderful. And could you just touch one more time on what a land bank can do and what a land bank can't do?
Sure, I'll take an early answer on that one, and then I'll look to Jeff and to Mary to help me out if I miss anything. But in terms of what a land bank can do, a land bank can acquire property, it can accept donations of property, it can transfer property, it can sell property, it can maintain property. But what it can't do is it can't force someone to sell property. And the other thing that it can't do is it actually cannot do those things by itself. It is actually dependent on the city of Wichita to approve those things, whether it's a sale, a transfer. So there are limitations on what a land bank can do. It can also work through title issues, and it can also work on dealing with taxes that are in arrears. That is Scott Wadel's general high-level view. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to see if he's got any more specifics.
No, that's very good. It does allow, as a separate entity, to be able to own property in its name. While it's owned, it is not accruing what's called ad valorem or property tax. So it provides an advantage that even the city may not have, because if the city were to acquire a property for the purpose of reselling it, it could be subject to taxation. So there's some advantages there. It might be that property is held for a very short period of time to assemble property to allow for 3 or 4 homes to be built in a given neighborhood or something of that nature. And it's more advantageous for some of the nonprofits to engage with that. And it's a tool to assist in the goal of the revitalization and development of these neighborhoods that are targeted.
Wonderful, thank you. This one came through over email. How do you plan to bring properties into the land bank? Outright purchase, tax sales, or other? Some people have said they're hearing that cities have the authority to speed up tax sales from 4 years tax delinquency to a shorter period. Is this correct, and how does that work?
Yes, there is a procedure in place now where if a property has been identified, it could be brought to the attention of the county who handles the tax sales to speed up the time in which it's listed to go to sale. Properties, like the land bank can acquire properties. That's all, what we acquire is dependent upon it could have such bad title issues that we may not be able to clean it up or this kind of thing. We also, as a land bank, would have to have the funds available to actually do the acquisition of the property or properties. So the limitation of the land bank would, of course, be the properties sought to be acquired or the monies available by the land bank to actually do that acquisition.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Jeff, which is the land bank has legal constraints, but it also has fiscal constraints, and it's going to depend on the resources that are available.
Wonderful. You touched on this earlier, but there has been some confusion on whether eminent domain is allowed. Could you just go over that one more time for us?
Sure. In Kansas, any entity, the city, county, school district, or like a utility that's been granted the right to engage in eminent domain is not allowed pursuant to Kansas statute to condemn a property and then immediately transfer it to somebody in the public. It has, in the private sector. It has to be acquired for the purpose of public use. Now, land banks do not engage in that at all. Its sole purpose is to try to serve as a conduit to transfer property from somebody who may not have been able to keep it up, may have inherited it, that has some title issues they don't know how to clean up, things of that nature. Clean those up and then get it back out into the market with a private individual as soon as possible so that they can become, it can enhance the neighborhood and things of that nature. Like I said, it is not anything that economically a land bank could really afford to engage in. An appraisal's $4,000 to $7,000. The cost of the appraisers and the condemnation could be thousands and thousands of dollars. There would be so much money invested in a given property that it would not be economical to proceed in that fashion. So I don't think it has the underlying authority to do it, but I've never seen a land bank actually engage in that because of the financial constraints.
And related to that, Jeff, I think one vehicle that we've talked about before, one method, is donations.
Correct.
And I think you've got a really good story that I think really provides some perspective on what is possible and some of the challenges that we face today and some of the advantages the land bank could provide. Would you mind telling folks or sharing just some insights about how,
Sure.
in your experience, you've seen a need for donations and there's a lack of that?
Correct. Personally involved with an individual that inherited his mother's property. It had a lot of issues that needed to be fixed and cleaned up just on the outside. He did not have the money to make those improvements. And so the property just sat there. He couldn't even afford to pay the taxes on it. And so as a result, it ultimately went into tax sale. This would provide an opportunity for somebody to donate property to the land bank. We're not going to advise anybody if it has any tax advantages for doing that, but it's an opportunity for getting out from under something they really didn't want to begin with. And so we would be willing to look at any property that somebody had, provided it met the parameters in the area, tax issues, or title issues of that nature, as a donation to the land bank.
And that's a really good point. So, Mary, a question for you is, let's say someone comes in with a property and they want to donate it. Is the land bank going to accept just any property? I mean, if I...
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The land bank is going to devise for themselves, along with guidance from staff, the policies and the procedures that they want and believe are appropriate for this land bank in this city. And that is, they are not going to automatically take any piece of property unless they truly believe that there is an end user and we have a fairly quick turnaround on what could be done with that, whether it's with the nonprofit sectors or if it's part of a redevelopment plan that the city has already adopted, things of that nature. So there's an intended use for any piece of property that a land bank takes in.
Along those lines, I think you just answered one of our questions, but would any donation that comes through be tax deductible?
We're not going to provide that. That's a certain legal advice that we're not going to provide to anybody. They would need to check with their own financial advisor as to whether that would be allowed or not. So.
And
Once the city acquires the property, are we responsible for the upkeep?
Land bank would be, once the city has acquired the property, authorized acquisition of the property, the land bank would be responsible for the maintenance of it. And that brings up the fact that, and emphasizes the point, that the land bank is going to have to be strategic about the properties that it acquires, and it's also going to have to make sure to transfer or sell those properties in a timely fashion, because you don't want the land bank to be overburdened by maintaining lots of properties. It just doesn't have the financial resources to deal with that. And then Angeline, I think you had a point.
Yes, and I wanted to go back to the question about eminent domain, because that often comes up as a concern with citizens when they hear of a governmental body that's looking to acquire property. And again, something that was mentioned that I want to reiterate, I think is important that the public understand, is that eminent domain legally cannot be utilized within a land bank, as Jeff stated earlier. But that really needs to be understood, that this is not a tool or a vehicle to force people to give over their property, not at all. Legally, that's not even something that we would be able to do through a land bank.
Well, I'd like to add something to that too, and that is, right now in the draft policies that we have, the land, we're not recommending that the land bank even take an occupied piece of property. So it has, no one can be living there in order for the land bank to acquire it.
I think those are both good points. Thank you.
Yeah, the land bank is not in the development business. We're not going to go out and seek properties to put up, some kind of a major development or anything like that. We simply couldn't afford to do so. Oftentimes what we're going to be looking for are vacant properties, because, like I said, we don't want anything that's occupied. We don't want to have to engage in an eviction or something of that nature. And it's very expensive to demolish a structure. We're going to be working on that a little bit more, but again, right off the bat, initially I think we'd probably be looking at just vacant properties that someone is voluntarily willing to sell or transfer to the land bank.
And related to that, how about a different scenario? Let's say someone has a house. It's maybe not in the best condition. They've inherited it from a family member. They say, wow, it seems like a nice property, but it's too much for me. It would take too much money to rehab it. But let's say the land bank sees it as an opportunity. What would a land bank do with a property like that? I mean, there's possibilities they could partnership to fix it up. Is that right, Jeff?
Certainly, a lot of land banks around the country have formed private partnerships with the public. Certain developers, certain builders, things of that nature. I even spoke to a gentleman in Kansas City who, that's kind of his mission. He actually does that, rehabs the properties for the land bank and things of that nature. So we'd be looking to form those private relationships. We certainly do not want to turn down a good opportunity. So that would assist us in being able to get it in a position where it could be sold.
So another way of thinking about that is that if the land bank if there was a strategic acquisition of a property that just met the guidelines, had a structure on it, a house, let's say, that wasn't in good shape, that the land bank could transfer it, sell it to another organization, a partner organization that could help fix it up and get that house back to productive use where someone could be living in it and contribute to the neighborhood.
Certainly, part of the application process in that sense is what we're looking into is having development agreements with a potential person to acquire it that would spell out that this is what they're going to do and how soon they're going to do it. So there'd be some limitations placed on somebody that would acquire it to make sure they just didn't acquire it and then it sits for 10 years and nothing happens. So, all these kind of avenues we're looking into and protecting that underlying asset of the land bank.
Now, when a proposal comes through, let's say an organization wants to acquire a piece of property, a proposal comes through, when would the public see it? They'd see it when it goes to the city council, correct?
Correct. As of now, the idea would be that the application would be filled out. It would be reviewed and probably by staff as well as by the Board of Trustees. If it is viewed to have met the requirements for redevelopment, revitalization of that thing, and a recommendation is made, then it would go to City Council for ultimate approval. If somebody were to fill out an application and said, I want to buy this lot for a quarter, the land bank could quickly say, it's denied, we're not going to even consider that because of the circumstance. So it's, we look at a number of factors. We obviously have goals and objectives. And so somebody wishing to purchase a property that meets those goals and objectives may not actually even be the highest bidder, because the highest bidder may want it for personal use. That's not what the land bank's for. So ultimately, we would consider those factors, the Board of Trustees would, and that would be presented to council for ultimate approval.
Wonderful. What about if people get behind on their taxes or maintenance, but they have equity in a property? Is that the sort of property a land bank might want? And are the typical title issues mortgage related, and who pays off that mortgage?
Great question.
Yeah, it would depend on the circumstance. Obviously, we're not here to help people bring their taxes current. How much of a mortgage is owed on it would be dependent on our ability to pay and whether it'd be worthwhile. We're not necessarily here to, and we're looking at some provisions that would in fact restrict someone from being able to purchase the property from the land bank if they had been living there within the 12 months preceding. So again, it's not necessarily designed to help out a particular individual with those kind of issues. It's more designed to take distressed property that otherwise is just sitting there and bringing it back into a revitalized state.
And I would point out from a practical standpoint, we've emphasized a lot about the nature of the land bank only being able to operate within the resources that it has, so it's fiscally constrained, and that, it's likely that a scenario like that might exceed the resources that a land bank has to address that situation.
Once we acquire the land, is the city responsible for the upkeep on that property?
The land bank is, not the
land
city
bank,
itself.
sorry, yes. Why not just incentivize the purchase of the properties and keep the government out of it? Let private citizens do this. What benefit does the land bank have from getting the city involved?
The city has incentives itself for developers and different individuals, to consider. The land bank is looking into one of the three segments that was pointed out earlier, are incentives. In addition to not accruing property tax, there could be some other things that the land bank might be able to do. For example, cleaning title up, stuff of that nature. There could be a lot more that we haven't really finalized that list or not. This is not per se, kind of just a handout to individuals, really. Mm-hmm. It's, we want to look at the whole neighborhood, try to, what we do, try to create the best, impact on that neighborhood.
And I think that's a great question, and Jeff, I think you've provided a really good answer. And the thing that I would emphasize is that in a lot of areas where the land bank's going to be functioning, the marketplace just simply is not functioning for whatever reason, give it that there's perhaps issues with the property, such as the title issues. It could also be perhaps it's in a location where there's not a lot of property transactions, so there's not comps. There could be a variety of circumstances that, for whatever reason, have not led to a fully functioning market that's able to take these properties and get them back into productive use. And so that's I think, where the strategic nature of the land bank can be really advantageous, in that you've got an organization that's focused on getting these properties back into good use, getting them, in some cases, back on the tax rolls, and that they're partnering with organizations in the private sector to get this done. So it's not a vehicle where it's doing it themselves, but it's through partnerships and transactions with the properties.
And another avenue of the land bank would be zoning, that we'll be talking about later, but there are lots in the central established area that are not standard size. They're not considered buildable lots. The land bank could acquire some of these properties and enhance the actual developmental, allow for that property to be more developed with circumstances that right now do not exist. So it's a way to incentivize other people to recognize there's opportunities for building a new house or whatever in that particular area.
So I think what I hear is that what we're saying, the land bank is but one tool for being able to enhance neighborhoods and communities here in Wichita.
That's exactly right. And that's a good point. And Angeline and Jeff, both the points that you've made in terms of it being one tool, and Jeff talking about the incentives. Now, Mary, we'll be looking at incentives and continuing to look at that.
That's right.
So it sounds like for folks, for the individual who had that question, if you're very interested in, are there other methods that can be used to get properties back into productive use, I'd say stay tuned. We're working on incentives, and right now we're at an early looking into it about, where is the market today? What does it cost in order to do development in these areas, do investments, and what's that gap? And so we're looking at it, different case studies and whatnot. We're not quite there yet in terms of having a product for folks, but we're at the early stages of doing that research.
We've had a couple questions come in about accountability. How are purchasers being kept accountable? And is there any sort of screening process to ensure that maybe past problematic purchasers do not participate in this program?
Correct. Part of the policies and actual procedures that we're working on does exactly that. We will be screening the applicant. We want to make sure that they have, the financial wherewithal to do what they're proposing to do. We could have deed restrictions that would require certain things to be done. As I said, development agreements where they would have to engage in something within a particular amount of time, and if they don't, then the land bank would have the right to come back and reobtain that property because they didn't do what they said they were going to do with it. If the individual applying is kind of what we call in the legal profession a frequent flyer, has a lot of troubles, and so we're going to try to weed those out and make sure that it's actually being used for the right purpose. We don't want, this is not an avenue for an individual to make a buck on. And so we want to do a very good job screening this as best we can to ensure that doesn't happen.
Along those lines, how are we dedicated to transparency throughout this process?
In addition to, the application will be there, and it goes before the city council. Every month, the ins and outs financially of the land bank are presented to the Board of Trustees and to the City Council. That's all going to go on a website. So, if somebody wants to find out, that we spent $200 on a title commitment, it will show up there. Nobody on the land bank is paid or compensated for their time. It's a volunteer situation. And the list of properties would be on the land bank website. Those that are sold and for how much will also be on there as well.
And I would add that the Board of Trustees meetings where they're entertaining some of these proposals, those too are open to the public.
That's correct.
How are the individuals on that board appointed?
Well, there are a series of qualifications. We want people that are from the real estate finance background, just the real estate background, people who have experience in construction, who understand what exists at a particular lot, so they know what we're doing. They've demolished properties, or they know what to look for in terms of contamination, those kinds of things. People with those types of backgrounds that allow the land bank to function are who will be on there. The city council then will appoint those 7 members. Okay, and hopefully we'll have a variety of experience from those 7 people. 2 of those people will be like a neighborhood representative. They'll represent either neighborhoods north of Kellogg and then neighborhoods south of Kellogg.
And I'd like to emphasize too that one factor that is going to be considered is also people could qualify if they have experience with neighborhood revitalization, and that's quite open in terms of what that means. So at the end of the day, it's a matter of they'll have to be appointed by a council member. So
How do people apply for that board?
And I think just related to that as well, that we just discussed the Board of Trustees, but the Board of Trustees will have the opportunity to create ad hoc committees that will be those connected to specific neighborhoods where these properties are, which will give more opportunity for more of the public to have a say and engagement with this process as well. So that's already a part of what we're considering.
I think that's great. That's an important perspective, is that there's the opportunity for these committees based on geography or based on particular types of things that they see on a routine basis. So excellent point, Angelin. And then in terms of Megan, I think you were going to ask how can someone go apply to be appointed? And you can, so this will be another board similar to existing city boards. So there's a process on the website where you can go to boards and committees and you can submit your application there. Now, I'd caution, don't do it right now. We're not at that stage yet, but I would imagine it would function very similar to how our other boards function now in terms of appointments.
Going back briefly to those ad hoc committees, will an effort be made to ensure that that is inclusive of the entire community and reflect the communities in which these land banks will occur?
So that was a lot of the conversation that we had as we were developing these documents, is how to ensure that we can have representation from the neighborhoods. But Jeff, I know you have more details.
Given the nature of what the land bank's engaging in, it's nice to have someone that has some experience in one of these related areas, but without a doubt, we want to try to be as inclusive and representative of the areas in question. Sometimes if that's not able to be done, we would hope to be able to do that by forming that ad hoc committee for that particular neighborhood, so they could tell the land bank what they would like in that neighborhood, whether it's a good idea, bad idea, and get that kind of input particularly. And so we may not need to have an ad hoc committee for every transaction, but anytime we're looking at, acquiring or anything in a particular area, I think, would be encouraged to have that advisory committee formed, or the ad hoc committee formed through members of like that neighborhood association or anything that we can go to try to find those individuals.
Will members of the advisory board or ad hoc committee be able to participate in the land bank?
No, they would not be able to buy property if they are on the board. And we're not looking to have any member of employee of the city or anything of that nature as well. I mean, this is something that we're going to lay out fully transparent, and so we just don't want any kind of questions in that sense.
Thank you. This is really aimed at revitalization, but how do we ensure that it doesn't cross over into gentrification?
Well, I think one important point is that the properties cannot be occupied, first and foremost. The second thing is that the purpose of it is to get properties back into productive use, and there's an emphasis, and this is in the ordinance, that it's about neighborhood revitalization, right? Which emphasizes the people making life better for the folks who are already there, as well as providing opportunities for investment in the neighborhood. So it really accomplishes.
The land bank
tries to
would
accomplish
not,
both.
we would sell it to somebody that would engage in the building of a property or rehabbing a property, whatever the case might be. But the land bank is not in the business of, approving who would buy it from the person that bought the property from us, if you will. So, we will do our best to make sure that it is going to be used for the stated purpose.
Mm-hmm. And an emphasis there is on a community purpose too.
Right.
And that's part of the evaluation of the proposals.
And that's what I was going to say too. There is an application that will come into play where those who have an interest in acquiring the property would need to share what their plan is for the property, as was mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. So that will be looked at and considered, and the purpose of what we're doing is for the public benefit. Mm-hmm. So that's going to weigh heavily on whether or not that person can acquire that property based on what the end use is and if it's reflective of the public benefit for the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
If the land bank has to be strategic about what properties it acquires, what incentive does it have to acquire a property in lower income areas that perhaps haven't been attractive to developers in the past?
I think the incentive there is to fulfill its mission and purpose, and to show that it's a viable, well-run organization that is implementing its intended purpose by the city. Most land banks, in fact, I think all that we did research on, require a subsidy in order to operate. And so this is not a revenue-making proposal. This is a mechanism. It's a structure that helps to get properties that are not actively in the market and not being productively used back engaged.
We've identified the central established area, and in that there are some nodes that we're going to be trying to focus on. The land bank's purpose is not to go out and try to buy a lot in some subdivision on the outskirts of town. That's not what we're wanting to do. Our purpose is to work in these areas that actually need revitalization and rehabilitation of the properties.
Although although I do want to add a caveat there to what Jeff has said, is that there may be special circumstances or a unique circumstance where that does apply in the acquisition of a property in a subdivision. But don't want to rule it out. But I think, just as Jeff has emphasized, that's not really the emphasis of the land bank. The emphasis is getting properties like we had talked about earlier that are overgrown, have been perhaps abandoned for quite some time, that just the market is not, they're not actively in the market, and getting them back into productive use.
There have been multiple questions about the need for affordable housing in our community. Will land banks support additional affordable housing in Wichita?
Yes, the answer is yes. And that is detailed in both the ordinance and it's identified in the draft policies documents.
That's right. Affordable housing is listed as one of its primary goals. It would say affordable housing and then revitalization of neighborhoods. So it has a very high priority.
Are there any tax incentives like TIFs available for the land bank?
I'm sorry, what?
Are there any tax incentives like TIFs?
I don't know that there's necessarily any pairing, but that's not to say that there isn't if you've got a qualifying project. But having a property go through the land bank itself is not a guarantee or a promise to participate as part of a TIF district. But at the same time, it's not exclusionary that it wouldn't. That would be a separate application process.
I don't know, honestly, if a TIF or STAR bonds can be initiated by a land bank. I think that would have to be by the city itself. And so from that perspective, I don't think we could go that route. We might receive some benefits from the city through funding through those mechanisms, but by the land bank itself doing it, I don't believe so.
That's a great clarification. I was thinking about it from the perspective of if someone acquires a property from the land bank, would it be eligible to participate in a TIF? And so I think the answer there is it depends, and it's a separate application process.
We have gotten several questions about specific properties in Wichita, and we'd encourage you to go to the link at the top of the feed and submit those on the website. But do you have any examples of properties that might be eligible for this type of project?
It is such a broad question. Nothing specific. I mean, we haven't even submitted the ordinance yet for consideration to City Council. There will be situations where people come to us saying, are you interested in this, and would vet it. There's going to be situations where maybe somebody from the land bank actually goes out and investigates and seeks property to be acquired for the land bank's purposes. So it's a little premature to consider anything specific at this point. That'll be coming later, and I'm sure through notification as this meeting was held or on the website, we'll be letting people know.
And I think to emphasize too that the land bank will have to be very selective because it won't have a lot of resources, and so it's really going to depend on a case by case basis of what properties are good. What might make for a good candidate property in one area of the city may not be a good candidate in another, just because of the dynamics of, is there a partner organization that's doing work in that area? Is that something that the neighborhood and the community sees as a goal in that area? There's a variety of different factors. So I think the easiest answer is it depends, and each circumstance is unique.
And I think if the public needs a visual to understand how this can work, earlier in the presentation that Scott shared, he showed a Habitat for Humanity example of a lot that on the left side was a very dilapidated, overgrown area that when you look to the right, you were able to see, I believe it was maybe 2 or 3 brand new homes that now that property had been changed to. So it's just a matter of looking around your neighborhood and having a vision of what it can be. And perhaps the situation will allow, the circumstance on a particular property that you may notice is one that the land bank could be of benefit to. It just really depends. It's very specific to that lot, very specific to that property, but it's really about the vision of what the neighborhoods could be and what the public sees as possibilities.
If a property is fast-tracked to tax sale, will that mean that the land bank has first dibs, or will the land bank committee have to bid the way the rest of potential auction bidders have to?
All that allows is that it be moved up in how quickly it is presented to the county for tax sale. We do not get any special benefits. We are standing in line to bid with everybody else at that time.
Okay. And are land banks a partnership with the county? How do we work with our county partners on this?
A land bank, a county can form a land bank, or a city can form a land bank. We can work with the county as far as, being if we've identified a given property that's coming up in a tax sale that we're interested in, or as we said, maybe trying to fast track a property to go through tax sale. But there will not be any direct contribution or involvement in the city's land bank, other than just general cooperation between the two entities.
And I think another way is just to say there also won't be any, as you emphasized earlier, that the land bank will be at the table just as similar as any other private person or organization, that there won't be any special latitude.
That's correct.
Provided.
We use some terms, and I know that this is determined on a case-by-case basis, but we talk about productive use and we talk about blighted properties. How do we determine what a productive use is? Are there any restrictions on what these properties can be developed into?
That's a great question. I think, and the answer is, again, it depends, and it's varied. For instance, I could provide an answer saying, well, it's about taxes that will be generated on the property, and in some cases that may be it. But think about an instance where a neighborhood is really looking to have a park. Well, that doesn't generate taxes, but in some cases that may be the preferred use of the property. So it's really going to depend on the circumstances, and it could be varied. And that's why the proposal process and having a land bank board is so important, because they'll be able to review the different applications that come in, and as has been indicated, it may be in some cases the one that brings the highest value in terms of monetary value, but in other cases it may be one that doesn't have that monetary value but enhances the quality of the life and achieves other community objectives.
We talked a little bit earlier in the broadcast about accountability. Could a developer potentially be involved, state that they were going to develop a property for one use, and then change or shift their plans?
I had mentioned this earlier, that the land bank can try to protect from that happening by either putting some kind of deed restriction on the property, or through the development agreement, that if it's not processed the way the application was stated, that we would be able to come back and take the property back. So, again, we're not trying to we really want to prevent somebody from taking it and then using it for personal gain in some capacity.
What's the process for engaging residents throughout this process?
A lot of that's going to depend throughout this process in terms of the process that we're currently in, or in terms of the process of, say, an acquisition is taking place, or a sale.
I believe this question is more aimed at acquisition and development of these properties.
Interesting question. I think part of that will be outlined in terms of the policies and procedures, which, again, we're still in the process of ironing that out. But we can look to examples of what is done in other communities, and I'm going to look to the rest of the panel members.
Yeah, we would again go to, with it, making sure that we're timely in processing the application, but ideally, we could look to the neighborhood organizations, the ad hoc committees that might be formed, that kind of information available to us to kind of run it by to make sure that it's appropriate.
And Jeff, also, will, as I'm thinking about the land bank, will there be an inventory of which properties are owned by the land bank? Will that be publicly available?
Yes. Again, any property that we have will be listed on the website. So if anybody's interested in it, they would be able to go look at it and make a bid. We would have, and what I've seen others do that I'm recommending is, information pertaining to maybe a property address sold, and so that people will know what has been brought in, donated, bought, or transferred or sold.
So if a property owner, let's say a neighbor, is just interested in what's happening with the property, they'll be able to see, number one, that the land bank has it. They'll be able to pay attention to the meetings of what's coming up, and then they'll have an opportunity to participate in those meetings, provide input at the land bank board level, and then also when it goes to the city council as well.
Correct.
We are at 7, so we're going a little bit over, but we're going to do one more. So in our FAQ, it says that potential properties have to be added to the land bank have long since been vacant and not been paying taxes. What does the land bank do that the market hasn't done?
That the market hasn't done.
Well, a lot of times there's situations where there are special assessments, which could be liens for nuisances, things of that nature against it, taxes that have accrued that, quite frankly, are more than the value of a lot is worth.
So let's maybe go through one of those scenarios. Let's say there's a house, let's say, that's been condemned. It gets demolished. What happens to the expense of demolishing that house?
Okay. The land bank, the way the tax sales work, the city seldom ever recovers the cost of doing that, if that's the case. But the land bank would be able to, waive the special assessments, the back taxes, and then it would not accrue any additional taxes during that period of time until it's transferred. Mm-hmm. So the market cannot do that, and I've seen a lot of times where there's just so much owed against the property that there's no way they can sell it because they would still owe money, or the purchaser would have to pay the difference, so nobody's interested in buying it. So it does allow for a number of factors, again, cleaning title up, cleaning the assessments or taxes, to where it makes it attractive for someone to look at to purchase.
Mm-hmm.
That's all we have time for, but we do have a form on the website pinned to the top of this feed. Please submit your questions there. We'll be happy to get back with you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.